Welcome to the Moonlit Archive. Tonight's entry, The Tomb of Tutankhamun. He was the least important pharaoh in the Valley of the Kings. His reign was short, his accomplishments were modest. His successors tried to erase his name from history. And that is precisely why, 3,000 years later, he is the most famous of them all. But here is the detail that undoes me, the detail I keep returning to, the one that makes this story impossible to set down once you have heard it. When they finally opened his coffin, after 33 centuries of silence, they found dried flowers resting on the golden mask. Cornflowers and lotus blossoms, placed there by someone who loved him. The petals still held the faintest ghost of their original blue. Someone, a wife, a servant, a friend whose name we will never know, had gathered wildflowers and laid them gently against the gold, and then the lid was sealed, and the tomb was sealed, and 3,300 years passed, and the flowers survived. We will come back to those flowers. There is a man I want you to know first. His name was Howard Carter, and he was not, by the standards of his profession, a particularly lucky man. He had been searching the Valley of the Kings for 6 years when his patron, a wealthy English lord named Carnarvon, told him the money had run out. 6 seasons of digging in the Egyptian heat, 6 seasons of moving thousands of tons of rubble by hand, 6 seasons of finding nothing of significance, while his colleagues whispered that the valley had given up its last secrets long ago. Every credible archaeologist in the world believed the valley was exhausted. Carter did not. He begged Carnarvon for one more season, just one, and offered to pay for it himself. That is an extraordinary thing to do, and we should pause to consider what it means. A man with no personal fortune offering to fund an excavation that every expert alive believed was pointless. What did Carter know that they did not? What had he seen, or failed to see, that kept him digging? The answer is a triangle of stone huts. Workers' huts, ancient and unremarkable, sitting on a patch of valley floor that no one had bothered to excavate beneath. Carter had noticed them years earlier, noted their position, and filed the observation away in the back of his mind, the way a careful man files away a question he cannot yet answer. We will come back to those huts. There is something else you should know before we go further. Within weeks of the tomb's opening, Lord Carnarvon was dead. Within months, the newspapers were printing stories of a curse, a dire warning supposedly inscribed above the entrance, promising swift death to anyone who disturbed the Pharaoh's rest. 17 people connected to the excavation died in the years that followed, or so the papers claimed. Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, a man who ought to have known better, declared publicly that the deaths were the work of ancient Egyptian elemental spirits. Carter himself dismissed the curse as, in his words, Tommy rot. He lived another 17 years, but the story would not die, because the story was irresistible, and irresistible stories have a way of surviving long after the truth has been carefully laid out beside them. There is a lesson in all of this, one of those quiet, patient lessons that history teaches only when you are willing to listen carefully and for a very long time. The lesson is this: sometimes the things that survive are not the things that were meant to survive. Sometimes the grandest monuments crumble first, precisely because they were grand, because they drew attention, because they invited envy, because they stood so tall and gleamed so brightly that every thief and conqueror for 30 centuries could see them from a distance and think, there is something worth taking. And sometimes a small tomb, dug in haste for a boy who died too young, sealed shut and then forgotten, is the thing that lasts. We are going to that valley tonight. A valley in Egypt, carved into limestone cliffs on the western bank of the Nile, across the river from the ancient city of Thebes. The Egyptians called it the Great Place, though you would not know it was great to look at it. If you were to stand in this valley at night, and tonight, in a way, that is exactly where we are standing, you would feel the heat still radiating from the rock beneath your feet, hours after sunset. The air would be still and impossibly dry, pulling the moisture from your skin, from your lips, from the very air inside your lungs. The stars overhead would be fierce and crowded and overwhelming. Not the faint, washed-out stars of a modern city, but the dense, pressing stars of a desert sky, so thick they seem to have weight. The silence would be almost total. No insects too dry for them. No water, there are no streams here, no rivers, no moisture of any kind. Just the stillness, and beneath the stillness, the faintest sound of wind moving across stone that has been baking in the sun since the age of the pharaohs. The limestone cliffs glow faintly in the starlight, a pale amber, the color of old parchment. 63 tombs have been cut into these walls and into the valley floor. Not all are royal. Some belong to favored courtiers, some to minor members of the royal family. A few are little more than unfinished pits, abandoned when resources or ambitions ran dry. But the valley has a presence that goes beyond its geology. Even skeptics feel it, a heaviness in the air, a sense of accumulated gravity, as if the weight of all those buried centuries has pressed itself into the stone and the silence and the warm, dry, breathless air. Somewhere beneath your feet, in a chamber carved from the living rock, a boy king has been sleeping for 3,300 years. He was buried with everything he would need for the afterlife: gold and alabaster and precious stones, chariots and walking sticks and board games, wine jars labeled with their vintage and vineyard, as if even the dead deserved to know the provenance of what they drank. A golden throne, a golden mask, and those flowers, those small, impossible, heartbreaking flowers, resting on the gold as if they had been placed there yesterday. And for those 3,000 years, the world above him changed and changed and changed again. Empires rose and fell. The language he spoke was forgotten. The gods he prayed to were abandoned. The very meaning of the paintings on his walls was lost. The hieroglyphs that recorded his name and his prayers became incomprehensible symbols, as mysterious to the people who lived above them as the stars are to us. But the boy king slept on, undisturbed, unaware. The dry desert air preserved him as no other climate on earth could have. The rubble from a later pharaoh's construction sealed his entrance as securely as any vault. The thieves who emptied every other royal tomb in the valley, who stripped the gold from mummies, who pried jewels from coffins, who carried away the treasures of 100 kings, somehow missed this one. They missed it because it was forgotten, and it was forgotten because a later pharaoh, a man named Hormheb, had deliberately erased the boy king's name from every official record, struck it from the king lists, chiseled it off the monuments, made it as if the boy had never lived, never ruled, never existed at all. It was the most thorough act of erasure in the ancient world, and it was the very thing that saved him. But we are not hurrying tonight. None of these threads need to be followed now. They will unspool in their own time, at their own pace, as the story carries us forward. Seeds planted in the dark. They will germinate when they are ready, and not a moment before. Tonight is for rest. Tonight is for the slow unwinding of the mind, the gradual releasing of the day, the gentle surrender to the darkness that is not darkness at all, but simply the world with its eyes closed. The valley is a good place for this kind of rest. It has been a place of rest for 3,000 years. The ancient Egyptians called the western bank of the Nile the land of the dead, not because they feared it, but because they understood that death and sleep are cousins, that the journey into night is a rehearsal for the longer journey that awaits us all, and that both journeys deserve to be made peacefully. There is no test tomorrow, no notes to take, no need to remember any of this at all. The story asks nothing of you except your presence. Simply rest, and let the story do what stories have always done, carry you somewhere you have never been, and bring you back safely when it is finished. If you fall asleep, the tomb will still be there. It has waited 3,000 years. It can wait a few hours more. And if you stay awake, that is fine too. Either way, the valley is quiet. The stars are turning overhead. The desert air is warm and dry and still, and somewhere beneath the limestone, a golden mask is gleaming faintly in the absolute darkness of a sealed room, patient as only gold can be. Close your eyes if you have not already, or leave them open, it makes no difference. The story finds you either way. Your body does not need to go anywhere tonight. Your body can remain exactly where it is, warm, comfortable, heavy with the pleasant weight of a day completed. Only the mind travels, and the mind is lighter than you think. It can cross oceans in an instant. It can cross centuries in a breath. It can descend 16 stone steps into the bedrock of a valley in Egypt and stand in a chamber of gold. And it can do all of this while the body rests, while the breathing slows, while the muscles release their grip on the day and surrender to the gravity of the night. Let the mind go where it wishes. If it wanders, let it wander. If it stays with the story, let it stay. There is no wrong way to listen. There is no wrong way to rest. Let us go there now, together, slowly, to a valley of dry stone and buried kings on the western bank of the Nile, where the sun sets over the land of the dead. Let us begin with the boy himself, with the world he was born into, the revolution that shaped his childhood, and the broken kingdom he inherited at the age of 8 or 9. A boy who never asked to be king. A boy who never expected to be remembered. Before there was a tomb, there was a child. He was born around 1341 before the Common Era, into a family that was the most powerful in the world. His father was the Pharaoh of Egypt, the ruler of a civilization that stretched from the cataracts of the Nile in the south to the shores of the Mediterranean in the north, from the deserts of Libya in the west to the trade routes of Sinai in the east. An empire of millions, old already when the Greeks were still illiterate tribesmen, ancient when Rome was not yet a village on a muddy hill. But the boy was born into crisis. His father, a man we know as Akhenaten, though that was not his original name, had done something unprecedented. Something that shook the foundations of a civilization that had stood for more than 1,000 years. He had abolished the gods. To understand what that means, you must first understand what the gods meant to Egypt. They were not abstract concepts, not distant philosophical propositions to be debated by scholars. They were real, present, woven into every aspect of daily life. Amun, king of the gods, whose great temple at Karnak was the largest religious structure in the world. Osiris, lord of the dead, who ruled the afterlife and judged the souls of the departed. Anubis, the jackal-headed guardian who guided the dead through the darkness of the underworld. Hathor and Thoth and Isis and dozens more, each with their temples, their priests, their festivals, their devotees. The gods were Egypt. To remove them was to remove the foundation upon which the entire civilization rested. And that is precisely what Akhenaten tried to do. He declared that there was only one God, the Aten, the sun disk, visible in the sky every day, radiating light and warmth upon the world. All the other gods were false. Their temples were to be closed. Their priests were to be dismissed. Their names were to be erased from every monument, every inscription, every record. The wealth of the old temples, and that wealth was staggering, accumulated over centuries, was to be redirected to the worship of the Aten. He went further. He abandoned Thebes, the ancient capital where generations of pharaohs had lived and ruled and been buried. He built an entirely new city in the desert, a city called Akhenaten, which we know today as Amarna. A city of gleaming white buildings and wide avenues and open-air temples where the sun could shine down unobstructed. He moved his entire court there. The scribes and generals, the priests and courtiers, the artists and builders and administrators who kept the empire running. Everyone. He took his queen with him, the famous Nefertiti, whose painted bust, discovered millennia later, would become one of the most recognized faces from the ancient world. She was, by all accounts, his partner in the revolution, not merely a consort but a co-ruler, depicted in the art of the period with a prominence and authority that no Egyptian queen had enjoyed before. In some images, she appears alone, smiting enemies, performing rituals that had previously been the exclusive prerogative of the pharaoh. She was powerful. She was beautiful. and she was, like her husband, utterly committed to the new religion. Together, they presided over a revolution that touched every aspect of Egyptian life. The art changed from the stiff, formal style that had endured for centuries to something more naturalistic, more intimate, more alive. The royal family was depicted in scenes of domestic warmth that had no precedent in Egyptian art. Akhenaten and Nefertiti playing with their daughters, holding them on their laps, kissing them, showing affection in ways that pharaohs had never been shown before. It was revolutionary, it was radical, it was in many ways beautiful. And it was a disaster. The old priests were furious. The army was restless. The empire was crumbling at its edges. Vassal states in Syria and Palestine were being lost to invaders, while the pharaoh concerned himself with theology and art. Letters have survived from desperate allies begging Egypt for military help that never came. The economy suffered as trade networks were disrupted, and the old temple workshops, which had been centers of production and employment for centuries, were shut down. The common people were bewildered. Their gods, the gods their families had worshipped for generations, the gods they prayed to when they were sick, when their children were born, when their loved ones died, had been taken from them. And what had been given in return? A sun disk, an abstraction, a god you could see in the sky but could not speak to, could not petition, could not plead with in the dark hours of the night when fear and grief pressed close. Akhenaten did not seem to care. Or perhaps he cared too much about his vision to accommodate the fears of ordinary people. He was a man possessed, consumed by a religious certainty that admitted no doubt, no compromise, no questioning. His hymns to the Aten are among the most beautiful religious poetry ever written. His sincerity appears to have been genuine, but sincerity, as history teaches again and again, is not the same as wisdom. And then he died. Around 1336, before the Common Era, after 17 years of rule, Akhenaten died. The cause is unknown, disease, perhaps, or the accumulated genetic burden of a royal family that had been intermarrying for generations. His body has never been definitively identified. He left behind a shattered kingdom and a child. The boy who would become Tutankhamun was probably 8 or 9 years old when he inherited the throne of Egypt. His original name was Tutankhamun, the living image of the Aten, his father's one god. He was a child in a court full of powerful adults, a boy surrounded by men who had their own ambitions, their own agendas, their own plans for how to use a child pharaoh to serve their purposes. Two men in particular shaped his reign. The first was I, who held the title of God's father, an elderly courtier, perhaps a relative of the boy's mother, who served as the young king's chief advisor. The second was Hormheb, the commander of the army, a military man, a practical man, a man who understood that an empire held together by force requires force to maintain it. Together, these two men guided the boy king through the most important decision of his reign, the restoration. The old gods were brought back. The temples were reopened. The priests were reinstated. The court abandoned Amarna and returned to Thebes. The boy's name was changed from Tutankhamun to Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. The revolution was over. Imagine being 9 years old and having the weight of a civilization placed upon your shoulders. Imagine being told that your father's life work, everything he had built, everything he had believed was wrong, and that you must undo it. Imagine sitting on a golden throne, wearing a crown too heavy for a child's head, while grown men knelt before you and called you the Lord of two lands, the ruler of everything the sun touches, the living God upon earth. And knowing, even then, that you were none of those things, that you were just a boy with a clubfoot that made walking painful, with bones weakened by the genetic burden of too many generations of royal intermarriage, with a body that was already failing him in ways that the court physicians could treat but not cure. He married. His wife was Ankhesenamun, quite possibly his half-sister, as was the custom of the royal family. She had been one of Akhenaten's daughters, and she had grown up in the strange, beautiful, doomed city of Amarna. We know almost nothing about their relationship, but there are clues. The golden throne found in his tomb depicts the two of them in a scene of tender intimacy. The young queen anointing her husband with perfumed oil, their faces close, their bodies leaning toward each other with an ease that suggests genuine affection. It is one of the most beautiful objects from the ancient world, and one of the most poignant. They had 2 children. Both were daughters. Both were stillborn. Their tiny mummified bodies were found in the tomb, placed there with the same care that attended every other object in that crowded golden chamber. 2 small coffins, 2 small hopes, 2 small griefs preserved for 33 centuries. Tutankhamun ruled for approximately 10 years. In that time, he restored the old religion, rebuilt damaged temples, sent military campaigns to Nubia and Syria, and tried to repair the damage his father's revolution had done. The work was guided by Eye and Horemheb, but the boy king's name appeared on the decrees, and it was his image that was carved on the temple walls, a slender young man in the double crown of Egypt, making offerings to the gods his father had tried to destroy. And then, around 1323 before the Common Era, at the age of 19, he died. The cause of his death has been debated for decades. Modern CT scans and DNA analysis have revealed a body that was already fragile bones weakened by genetic disorders, a severely broken left leg that may have become infected, evidence of multiple bouts of malaria. Some scholars believe a fall, perhaps from a chariot, shattered his already weakened leg, and the infection that followed, compounded by malaria, was more than his body could withstand. Others point to different evidence, different theories. The truth is that we do not know with certainty what killed him. We know only that he was young, and that his death was not expected, and that the tomb they buried him in tells us, in 100 small details, that the preparations were rushed. He was 19. He had been Pharaoh for a decade. He had undone his father's revolution and restored the old gods. He had a wife who may have loved him, and 2 daughters who never drew breath. He had a clubfoot that made every step painful, and a body that was already failing when most young men are at the peak of their strength. and in the grand scheme of Egyptian history, he was nobody, a minor pharaoh in a long line of pharaohs, a footnote between the dramatic revolution of Akhenaten and the military might of the Ramessids who came after. His successors, then Horemheb, struck his name from the official records, erased his Cartouche from the monuments, removed him from the king lists that recorded the proper succession of pharaohs. As far as official Egyptian history was concerned, Tutankhamun had never existed. They erased him to forget him. And in doing so, they saved him. The Valley of the Kings is not a valley of the living. It was chosen 500 years before Tutankhamun's time as the burial ground for the pharaohs of the New Kingdom, the great rulers of Egypt's imperial age. The pharaohs of the Old Kingdom had built pyramids, vast, visible, unmistakable monuments that advertised their presence to every traveler and every thief for 100 miles in every direction. The result was inevitable. Every pyramid was robbed. The gold was stripped. The jewels were pried loose. The mummies were unwrapped and discarded. All that grandeur, all that effort, all that stone, and the tombs were empty before the pyramids were half a millennium old. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom learned the lesson. If you cannot protect a tomb by making it conspicuous, perhaps you can protect it by making it invisible. The valley they chose was a desolate ravine on the western bank of the Nile, opposite Thebes. It had one narrow entrance which could be guarded. Its walls were steep limestone cliffs, difficult to climb, easy to patrol. The rock itself was ideal for carving, firm enough to hold its shape, but soft enough to be worked with copper and bronze tools. And it was dry. Desperately, absolutely, permanently dry. The kind of dry that preserves things for millennia. Over the centuries, more than 60 tombs were carved into the valley's walls and floor. Some were enormous. The tomb of Seti the First descends more than 300 feet into the rock, its corridors painted with scenes of such beauty that early European visitors wept when they saw them, believing they had discovered the work of angels. Others were modest, small chambers for minor royals, unfinished projects abandoned when a reign ended unexpectedly. And despite the secrecy, despite the guards, despite the narrow entrance and the steep cliffs, every single one of them was robbed. Every single one. The tomb robbers of ancient Egypt were patient, resourceful, and bold. They knew the valley intimately. Some of them were the very workers who had carved the tombs, who knew the layouts, who knew where the treasure chambers were, who knew which corridors led to dead ends and which led to gold. They worked at night by lamplight, chipping through sealed doorways, squeezing through narrow passages, risking death by cave-in or suffocation or discovery, and they were thorough. They stripped the tombs of everything valuable: gold, silver, precious stones, perfumed oils, fine linen, ebony and ivory. They left behind only what they could not carry, or what was too bulky to be worth the effort. The authorities fought back. Guards were posted. Inspections were conducted. Tomb robbers, when caught, were tortured and executed. Records of the trials survive as papyrus documents in which the accused confess to breaking into specific tombs, describing what they found and what they took, providing details so precise that modern archaeologists have used them to identify which tombs were robbed and when. But the robbers always won in the end. The gold was too tempting, the guards were too few, the valley was too large, and the centuries were too long. One by one, the royal tombs were emptied. Consider the scale of what was lost. The tomb of Ramesses the Great, the most powerful pharaoh who ever lived, the man who built Abu Simbel and fought the Battle of Kadesh and ruled for 67 years, was stripped bare. When archaeologists found it, the corridors were empty, the walls were scarred by water damage, and the only traces of its former glory were the faded paintings on the walls and a few fragments of pottery on the floor. The golden sarcophagus was gone. The jewels were gone. The precious furniture and the ritual objects and the provisions for the afterlife, all gone, scattered into the hands of thieves and then into the marketplace, melted down, broken apart, lost forever. Multiply that loss by 60. That is what happened in the Valley of the Kings. 60 tombs, each one filled with the treasures of a pharaoh's reign, each one emptied by hands that cared nothing for history and everything for gold. The wealth of an entire civilization, accumulated over centuries, dispersed into nothingness. We know these pharaohs from their monuments and their inscriptions, from the records they left carved in stone, but we do not know what their burial treasures looked like. We can only imagine, based on what we know of Egyptian craftsmanship, what was lost. And that is why the tomb of Tutankhamun matters so much. Not because the boy king was great, he was not. Not because his treasures were the finest ever made, they probably were not. The great pharaohs, the Ramessids and the Thutmosids, were likely buried with objects that made the contents of Tutankhamun's tomb look modest. But those objects are gone. Melted, broken, scattered, forgotten. And the boy king's objects survived. They are the only complete royal burial assemblage ever found, the only window into what an Egyptian pharaoh took with him into the afterlife. Without this tomb, we would have no idea. With it, we have 5,398 answers. Tutankhamun's tomb was robbed too. Twice, in fact, within a few years of his burial. The robbers broke through the outer door, tunneled through the rubble that filled the corridor, and broke through the inner door. They made it into the antechamber and ransacked it, overturning boxes, tearing open shrines, grabbing anything small enough to carry. They may have entered the annex as well, that small side room crammed with hundreds of objects. But they were caught or interrupted or frightened away. We can piece together what happened from the evidence Carter found 3,000 years later. The robbers had been selective. They had taken small, valuable items that could be carried easily and sold quickly. Oils and unguents were particularly targeted because perfumed oils were enormously valuable in the ancient world, worth their weight in gold, in some cases, and far easier to transport and sell than bulky furniture or heavy statues. The evidence suggests that the robbers poured oils from their containers into leather skins, spilling some in the process, leaving greasy stains on the floor and on the objects they brushed past. The necropolis officials resealed the doors, repacked the corridor with rubble, and attempted to restore order to the ransacked chambers. They were not entirely successful. Many objects had been displaced from their original positions, and some were never put back properly. This explains the appearance of chaos that Carter found in the antechamber and annex, the jumbled arrangements, the objects piled on top of each other, the general disorder that looked like carelessness, but was actually the aftermath of theft and hasty repair. The tomb had been violated, but not emptied. The burial chamber, with its golden shrines and its golden coffins and its golden mask, remained intact. The robbers had not penetrated that far, or had not had time to reach the most valuable treasures before they were interrupted. And then something remarkable happened. Something that no one planned, that no one intended, that occurred through nothing more than the random accumulation of events across centuries. The tomb was forgotten. Horemheb, who had served the boy king as general, and then seized the throne after Ai's brief reign, set about erasing Tutankhamun from history. He claimed the boy king's monuments as his own. He chiseled Tutankhamun's name from inscriptions and replaced it with his own. He removed the boy from the official king lists, those carefully maintained records that every pharaoh kept, listing the proper succession of rulers from the beginning of time. As far as the official record was concerned, the succession went directly from Amenhotep III to Horemheb. The heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, the boy king Tutankhamun, and the elderly Ai all were erased. All were unmade. With no name in the records, there was no reason for anyone to maintain the tomb. No priests came to make offerings. No officials came to inspect the seals. The tomb's existence faded from institutional memory, as things do when no one has a reason to remember them. And then, approximately 200 years later, the workers building the tomb of Ramesses VI, a much larger, much grander tomb cut into the hillside directly above, dumped their construction debris across the valley floor. Tons of limestone chips and rubble cascaded down the slope and buried the entrance to the boy king's tomb. Buried it completely. The 16 stone steps that descended to the outer door vanished beneath a layer of debris several feet thick. was not intentional. The workers had no idea that a tomb lay beneath them. They were simply disposing of rubble in the most convenient place available, as construction workers have done since the beginning of time. But the effect was as secure as any deliberate concealment could have been. The tomb was sealed, not by engineering or ingenuity, but by accident, by the carelessness of men who were building something else entirely. And there it remained, for 3,000 years. While the dynasties of Egypt rose and fell, the Ramessids, the Libyans, the Nubians, the Persians, each wave of rulers leaving its own mark on the ancient land. While Alexander the Great conquered Egypt and his successors, the Ptolemies built a new capital at Alexandria and filled it with libraries and lighthouses. While Cleopatra loved and lost, and the Roman legions marched into the land of the pharaohs and made it a province of their empire. While the temples were abandoned, one by one, as Christianity replaced the old religion, and the meaning of the hieroglyphs was forgotten, and the very language that had recorded the boy king's name became incomprehensible. While the Arab conquest brought a new language and a new faith, while the centuries continued to accumulate, like the rubble that covered the tomb, layer upon layer upon layer. While Napoleon's scholars catalogued the monuments and Champollion decoded the hieroglyphs, and the modern science of archaeology was born, and men came to the valley with shovels and notebooks, and the strange, obsessive conviction that the ground had secrets worth discovering. Through all of this, through every conquest and every forgetting, through every transformation of the world above, the boy king slept on. Beneath the rubble, beneath the tourists who walked unknowingly over his tomb, beneath the stars that turned above the valley in their slow, eternal arcs, forgotten by the world, preserved by forgetting. The man who would find him was not born to privilege. Howard Carter came into the world on the 9th of May, 1874, in the London suburb of Kensington. His father, Samuel Carter, was a successful artist, a painter of animals particularly, who made his living producing portraits of the prized pets and livestock of the English gentry. It was a respectable trade, if not a glamorous one, and it left the family comfortable but not wealthy. boy was sickly as a child. He suffered from ailments that kept him home from school for long stretches, educated by private tutors and by his father, who taught him to draw. The drawing would prove to be the most important skill of his life, though not in the way either father or son could have imagined. Here is a detail worth knowing if you are still awake to hear it. When the young carter applied for his first position in Egypt as a tracer and copyist, hired to draw the paintings and reliefs in ancient tombs, he could not even spell the word archaeology correctly on his application. He rendered it in half a dozen creative variations, none of them right. He never attended university. He had no formal training in the field that would make him famous. He was, in every conventional sense, unqualified, and yet he became the most famous archaeologist who ever lived. There is something in that, something about the difference between credentials and calling, something about what happens when a person finds the thing they were born to do, regardless of whether anyone else believes they were born to do it. Carter arrived in Egypt in 1891 at the age of 17. He was hired by the Egypt Exploration Fund as a tracer, a young artist whose job was to make accurate copies of the paintings and reliefs in the ancient tombs. It was painstaking work, requiring hours of careful observation in dark, hot, airless tomb chambers, working by lamplight, capturing every detail of images that had been painted 3,000 years before. He loved it. From the first day, from the first moment he descended into an ancient tomb and saw the painted walls glowing in the lamplight, he knew that this was what he was meant to do. The heat did not bother him. The dust did not bother him. The long hours of cramped, painstaking work in dark chambers did not bother him. He had found his calling, and the calling consumed him. The tomb spoke to him, not in words, though the hieroglyphs covered every surface, but in something deeper. In the quality of the painted lines, in the colors that still glowed in the lamplight, in the faces of the gods and kings and common people who stared back at him from the walls with an intensity that 3 millennia had not diminished. He spent hours underground, drawing and observing, developing an intimacy with ancient Egyptian art that no university course could have provided. His talent was noticed. He was promoted, given more responsibility, allowed to participate in excavations as well as documentation. He worked at several sites across Egypt, learning the practical skills of archaeology, how to dig without destroying, how to remove objects without damaging them, how to read the stratigraphy of the earth itself, those layers of soil and debris that told the story of what had happened in a place over centuries and millennia. By his late 20s, Carter had risen to become the chief inspector of antiquities for Upper Egypt, a position of considerable authority and responsibility. He was based in Luxor, the modern city that sits atop the ruins of ancient Thebes, and his jurisdiction included the Valley of the Kings. He was good at the job, meticulous, thorough, obsessive about detail in a way that irritated his colleagues but produced results. He was also, by all accounts, difficult. Carter had a temper, a fierce, stubborn, uncompromising temper that made him enemies at every level of the archaeological establishment. He was not diplomatic. He did not suffer fools. He did not bend to political pressure or social convention. He was, in the words of one contemporary, impossible to work with and impossible to work without. In 1905, his temper destroyed his career. A group of French tourists visiting a site under his jurisdiction behaved badly. They were drunk, they were disrespectful, they demanded entry to areas that were closed. Carter's Egyptian guards confronted them. A scuffle ensued. The French tourists complained to their consul. The consul demanded an apology. Carter was ordered to apologize. He refused. It was a matter of principle, he said. His guards had been right. The tourists had been wrong. He would not apologize for doing his duty. The authorities insisted. Carter refused again. And so, at the age of 31, one of the most promising archaeologists in Egypt was dismissed from the Antiquities Service. What followed were years of misery, the kind of quiet, grinding misery that does not make for dramatic stories, but that wears a person down from the inside, like water wearing down stone. carter scraped by in Luxor, selling watercolors to tourists, serving as a guide and translator for wealthy visitors, doing whatever he could to survive. His watercolors were good. His father had taught him well, and he had a particular gift for capturing the warm, golden light of the Egyptian landscape, the way the shadows fell across the ancient stones, the quality of the air at dawn and dusk when the valley seemed to glow from within. But selling paintings to tourists was not the life he had imagined for himself. It was not the life he was meant for. He had no income beyond what each painting brought, no position, no prospects. The archaeological establishment wanted nothing to do with him. He was talented but toxic, too proud, too stubborn, too convinced of his own rightness to make the compromises that a career in a bureaucratic system requires. He was also, during those years, developing an expertise that no formal education could have provided. He spent his free time, and he had a great deal of free time, exploring the valley on foot, mapping every feature of the terrain, studying the positions of the known tombs, reading everything he could find about previous excavations. He became, through sheer persistence and observation, one of the foremost experts on the Valley of the Kings, a man who knew every wadi, every cliff face, every pile of rubble, every tomb entrance as intimately as he knew the rooms of his own house. He was also, during those years, deeply lonely. Carter never married. He had few close friends. His social skills were rudimentary at best, and his years in the wilderness only sharpened the edges of a personality that had never been smooth. He was a man alone with his obsession, because even in exile, even in poverty, even selling watercolors to indifferent tourists, he never stopped thinking about the Valley of the Kings. He had a theory, a conviction really, bordering on faith. He believed that there was at least one undiscovered tomb in the valley. He had studied the records, mapped the known tombs, analyzed the ancient sources. He knew that certain pharaohs had been buried in the valley whose tombs had never been found, and among those missing tombs, one name kept returning to him, a name that appeared only in fragments and hints and oblique references. Tutankhamun, a minor pharaoh, a boy king, a name that most Egyptologists barely bothered with if they knew it at all. But Carter was convinced that the boy's tomb was there, somewhere hidden beneath the rubble of the valley floor. He just needed the resources to look for it. In 1907, fate intervened in the unlikely form of a wealthy English aristocrat with a broken body and too much time on his hands. George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, had very nearly died in a motor car accident in Germany. It was the early days of the automobile, when the machines were unreliable and the roads were unpaved and the concept of speed limits had not yet been invented. His car overturned on a muddy road. He was pulled from the wreckage with broken bones, a punctured lung, and burns that would scar him for life. His doctors told him that the damp, cold winters of England would be dangerous for his weakened lungs. They recommended a warm, dry climate. They recommended Egypt. And so Lord Carnarvon arrived in Cairo, a bored and restless aristocrat looking for something to fill the long, warm winter months. He tried collecting. He tried tourism. He tried everything that wealthy Englishmen tried in Egypt in those years. And then someone introduced him to archaeology. He was entranced. Here was something that combined the thrill of treasure hunting with the prestige of scholarship, the romance of the ancient world with the practical business of digging in the dirt. He began funding small excavations, but he needed a professional, someone who could direct the work, who knew the valley, who had the skill and the knowledge to turn his money into discoveries. Someone recommended Carter. It was an improbable partnership. Carnarvon was everything Carter was not: wealthy, titled, socially graceful, effortlessly charming. Carter was everything Carnarvon was not: trained, experienced, obsessive, unglamorous. They should have despised each other. Instead, they formed one of the most productive collaborations in the history of archaeology. Carnarvon provided the money. Carter provided the expertise. And together, they set their sights on the Valley of the Kings. They began digging in 1917. Carter had obtained a concession, a legal permit to excavate for the Valley of the Kings, and he threw himself into the work with the single-minded intensity that characterized everything he did. He had a plan. He had mapped the valley meticulously, marking every known tomb, every previous excavation, every area that had already been explored. What remained was a triangular patch of ground near the center of the valley, between the tombs of Rameses II, Rameses VI, and Meremptor. Carter was convinced that if the tomb of Tutankhamun existed, it was there. The work was brutal. Each day, Carter's crew of Egyptian laborers dug through layers of limestone chips and sand, filling baskets that were carried away on the heads of women and children. The sun was merciless. The dust was suffocating. The heat in the valley could exceed 120 degrees, trapped and amplified by the limestone walls that surrounded them on every side. And for 5 seasons, they found nothing. Nothing is perhaps too strong a word. They found fragments. They found pottery shards and bits of faience and the occasional seal impression in dried mud. They found evidence, tantalizing, incomplete, maddening evidence that suggested the tomb was nearby. A small cache of objects bearing the name of Tutankhamun had been found by Theodore Davis years earlier, not far from where Carter was digging. Broken cups and linen wrappings and dried floral garlands, the remnants, perhaps, of the embalming materials used during the king's mummification. These fragments were enough to sustain Carter's conviction. They told him the tomb was close, but close in archaeology can mean inches or miles. Close can mean tomorrow or never. Each season began in October or November, when the brutal summer heat of the valley finally began to relent, and ended in March or April, when the temperatures climbed again to levels that made sustained physical labor dangerous. Even in the cooler months, the valley was punishing. The air was dry enough to crack skin and lips. The limestone dust worked its way into everything: clothes, hair, lungs, food. The light was harsh and relentless, reflected and amplified by the pale cliffs, until the valley became a bowl of white glare that could cause snow blindness even in the desert. For 5 or 6 months each year, Carter was in the valley, supervising the daily work, checking the baskets of rubble for any artifact that might have been missed, recording the progress of each trench, each pit, each test shaft. For the remaining months, he was in England, or in Cairo, or in Luxor, planning, mapping, analyzing, preparing for the next assault on the rock and rubble of the valley floor. Season after season, the baskets of rubble were carried away. Season after season, the trenches grew deeper and wider. Season after season, Carter reported to Carnarvon that the work was proceeding, that progress was being made, that the area was being systematically cleared. And season after season, there was nothing to show for it but empty ground and expense. The costs were enormous. Carter employed between 50 and 200 workers at any given time, depending on the phase of the excavation. There were wages to pay, tools to maintain, equipment to purchase, permits to renew, officials to appease. Carnarvon, for all his wealth, was not made of unlimited money, and the valley, that desolate gash in the limestone, seemed determined to give up nothing. Other archaeologists were skeptical. Some were dismissive. The American Theodore Davis, who had held the concession before Carnarvon, had already declared the valley exhausted. "I fear that the Valley of the Tombs is now exhausted," he wrote. "There was nothing left to find," he said. "Everything that was there had already been discovered." Carter disagreed, but disagreeing is easy. Proving a negative, demonstrating that something is not there by looking everywhere, takes time and money and faith. And by the summer of 1922, all three were running low. In June of that year, Carter traveled to England to meet Carnarvon at Hickler Castle, the Earl's ancestral home, a magnificent pile of Victorian Gothic architecture set in the rolling green countryside of Hampshire. It is a measure of how different these two men were that Carter arrived at this stately home like a supplicant arriving at court, aware that his patron's patience and purse were both approaching their limits. The meeting was painful. They sat in the great library of Heclear, a room of dark wood and leather-bound books, of tall windows that looked out onto the green Hampshire countryside, as different from the Valley of the Kings as any room on earth could be. Carnarvon was kind but direct. 5 seasons, thousands of pounds, no results. The newspapers were losing interest. His financial advisors were questioning the expenditure. His friends were quietly suggesting that the whole enterprise was a folly, a rich man's expensive hobby that had produced nothing but sunburn and empty holes in the ground. He was prepared, he said, to withdraw his support. The valley was exhausted, just as Davis had said. It was time to stop. Carter argued. He laid out his maps, his records, his reasoning. He showed Carnarvon the one area that remained unexplored, a small patch of ground near the entrance to the tomb of Rameses VI. He had been reluctant to dig there because it was covered by the huts of the workmen who served the tourists visiting the Rameses tomb. Digging would mean displacing those workmen, disrupting the tourist trade, inviting bureaucratic opposition. But it was the last piece of the puzzle. The last unexplored ground in his carefully mapped triangle. One more season, he said, just one more, and he made an extraordinary offer. He would pay for it himself. He would fund the final season out of his own pocket, out of savings that were already meager, out of resources that were already stretched thin. He believed that strongly. He was willing to bet everything he had. Carnarvon was moved. Whether by the argument or by the gesture, he relented. He would fund one final season. One more. After that, they were done. Carter returned to Egypt in late October 1922. On November 1st, he arrived in the Valley of the Kings and set his crew to work removing the workmen's huts that covered the unexplored ground. The huts came down. The ground beneath was cleared to bedrock. 3 days later, on the morning of November 4th, the air in the valley was already warm by mid-morning, though the worst of the summer heat had passed. The crew was working in the cleared area, removing the last of the surface debris, exposing the bedrock layer by layer. It was routine work, the kind of work that makes up 99% of any excavation, the kind that does not make headlines or stir the heart, the kind that must be done before anything can be found. A water boy arrived at the site carrying a large clay jar. He was a child. The accounts differ on his exact age, but he was young, employed to carry drinking water from the village to the workers in the valley. He set his jar down in the loose rubble near the excavation trench. And the jar sank, just slightly. It settled into a depression in the debris, and as the boy adjusted it, the loose rubble shifted, and the edge of something flat and regular appeared beneath the surface. A stone step, cut into the bedrock. Clean, straight, deliberate, unmistakably the work of human hands. The boy called out. The foreman came. Carter was summoned, and as the debris was brushed away from the flat stone, a second step appeared beneath it, then a third, then a fourth. A descending staircase was emerging from beneath the rubble of the valley floor. Each step was cut cleanly into the bedrock, smooth and regular, the work of stone cutters who knew their craft. The steps descended at a gentle angle, leading downward into the rock, toward whatever lay beneath. The limestone was pale and clean where the rubble was brushed away, as if the steps had been carved yesterday, not 3,000 years ago. The dry air of the valley had preserved them perfectly. No water damage. No erosion, just clean, sharp edges, as precise as the day they were cut. Carter's hands were trembling. 5 years of fruitless digging. 5 years of doubt and expense and ridicule from his colleagues. 5 years of faith in a theory that everyone else had dismissed. And now, beneath the feet of a water boy, the first step of a staircase that could only lead to one thing. He cleared 12 steps that day, then he stopped. He stopped because he could see, at the bottom of the staircase, the upper portion of a sealed doorway, a wall of plaster covered in stamps and impressions. A sealed doorway in the Valley of the Kings. The first undisturbed seal found in the valley in modern times. And he stopped because he had made a promise. He had promised Carnarvon that if he found anything significant, he would wait. He would not open anything without his patron present. It was a matter of honor and of debt, and of the fundamental fairness that even a man as stubborn and difficult as Carter felt he owed the man who had funded his obsession for more than 15 years. So he filled the staircase back in, he posted guards, he sent a cable to England. The cable read, "At last have made wonderful discovery in valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations." The cable crossed the Mediterranean and arrived at Hickler Castle. Carnarvon read it and understood immediately. He began making arrangements, canceling engagements, booking passage, packing the clothes and equipment he would need for a winter in the valley. His daughter, Lady Evelyn, insisted on coming. She had been to Egypt before, had caught her father's enthusiasm for the ancient world, and had no intention of missing this. And then Carter waited. For 2.5 weeks, while Lord Carnarvon arranged his affairs, packed his bags, boarded a steamship, crossed the Mediterranean, traveled by train to Cairo, and made his way up the Nile to Luxor, Howard Carter waited. With the most important archaeological discovery of the 20th century lying beneath a few feet of rubble, guarded by a handful of trusted men in a valley of dry stone, he waited. He filled the staircase back in with rubble to protect it. He posted guards, Egyptian workers he trusted, men who would not talk, who would not spread rumors that might attract unwanted attention. The valley was a public place, frequented by tourists and other archaeologists and the workers who served them all. News of a discovery would travel fast, and Carter knew that curiosity was the enemy of caution. He needed time. He needed Carnarvon. And so he buried his discovery again and sat on top of it, figuratively speaking, like a dragon on its hoard, and waited. He spent the days making preparations. He ordered supplies, packing materials, photographic equipment, conservation chemicals. He wrote letters. He planned. He made lists of the things he would need if the tomb proved to be what he hoped it was. And at night, in his house on the edge of the cultivated strip, with the darkness of the valley visible through his windows and the stars turning overhead, he lay awake and thought about what might lie beneath those sealed doors. It must have been the longest 2 weeks of his life. Carnarvon arrived on November 23rd, accompanied by his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, a young woman of 21 who shared her father's enthusiasm for Egypt and who would become one of the first people in 3,000 years to enter the tomb. The next morning, the work of clearing the staircase began again. Those 2.5 weeks of waiting had been an extraordinary test of Carter's discipline. He knew what was there, or rather, he knew that something was there. A sealed doorway in the Valley of the Kings. The first undisturbed seal found in the valley since the tombs were first excavated. Behind that door could lie anything, a complete royal burial, an empty room, a passage to further chambers, or simply a disappointed hope. He did not know. And for 17 days, while his patron crossed the Mediterranean on a steamship, he sat with that uncertainty, guarding his secret, telling almost no one, waiting. The full staircase was revealed, 16 steps descending into the bedrock. At the bottom, the sealed doorway came fully into view for the first time. It was a wall of roughly plastered stones, covered in oval impressions, the stamps of the necropolis officials, the ancient bureaucrats responsible for sealing and securing the royal tombs. Carter examined the seals carefully. His practiced eye could read them, or rather, could read some of them. The impressions of the necropolis seal were clear. A jackal above 9 bound prisoners, the symbol of the guardians of the dead. These were the official seals. They confirmed that whoever was buried here was someone of importance, important enough to warrant the attention of the necropolis administration. But there was something else, something that made Carter's breath catch. In the lower portion of the door, he found a different seal. A cartouche, the oval ring that enclosed a pharaoh's name in hieroglyphs, and the name inside that cartouche was one he knew. Nebkipurari, the throne name of Tutankhamun. After 5 years of searching, after 15 years of partnership, after decades of conviction that the boy king's tomb was there to be found, there was his name. stamped in plaster, 3,000 years old, exactly where Carter had said it would be. The moment was everything Carter had worked for, and simultaneously it was terrifying, because the presence of the name was also a burden. If this was the tomb of Tutankhamun, and if it had been robbed as every other tomb in the valley had been robbed, then the discovery would be a bitter one. A sealed door with a royal name on it, leading to empty chambers, stripped bare 3,000 years ago. Carter had seen such disappointments before. The valley was full of them. Doors that had been sealed with great ceremony and then broken open by thieves. Corridors that led to empty rooms, sarcophagi that lay open and vacant, their contents long since melted down or sold in the bazaars of ancient Thebes. But Carter's excitement was tempered by a troubling observation. In the upper left corner of the sealed door, there was evidence of a breach. A section that had been broken through and then resealed, plastered over, but with a different plaster, applied at a different time. The necropolis seal covered the repair, which meant that the authorities had known about the break-in and had resealed the tomb. But it also meant that someone had gotten in. The tomb had been entered at least once since the original burial. The question was, how much had they taken? The team dismantled the sealed door carefully, stone by stone, and revealed what lay beyond. A descending corridor approximately 30 feet long, filled floor to ceiling with rubble. Limestone chips and dust packed tight, filling the passage completely. The rubble itself told a story. In the upper left corner, there was a darker, looser fill, a tunnel that had been dug through the original packing and then refilled. The path of the ancient robbers, coming and going through their tunnel, and the path of the necropolis officials who had filled it back in. The corridor was cleared. It took several days of careful work, with Carter supervising every basket of rubble that was removed, watching for artifacts that might have been dropped by the ancient thieves. And artifacts were found. Scattered among the rubble were fragments of pottery, pieces of painted plaster, a few seal impressions in dried mud. These were the detritus of the ancient break-ins, things dropped by the robbers in their haste, or dislodged from the walls during the forced entries. Carter noted each one, cataloged each one, filed each one away as evidence in the 3,000-year-old crime scene he was slowly piecing together. The corridor descended at a slight angle, running roughly 30 feet into the bedrock. As they cleared deeper, the air grew thicker, warmer, staler. The electric lamps they carried illuminated walls of rough-cut limestone, not the smooth, painted surfaces of a grand royal tomb, but the unfinished walls of a modest burial. Everything about this tomb was telling Carter the same story. It had been built in haste. It was too small for a pharaoh. It was probably not intended for a king at all. Perhaps originally dug for a noble or a high official, then hastily repurposed when the boy king died unexpectedly and a proper royal tomb had not yet been prepared. And at the far end of the corridor, they encountered a second sealed doorway. More plaster, more seal impressions, more evidence of a breach and a repair. This was the door that mattered. Behind the first door was a corridor. Behind this door was whatever the tomb contained. 3,000 years of silence lay on the other side of this plaster wall. 3,000 years of darkness, undisturbed by human presence, untouched by human hands, unknowing of the world that had changed so utterly on the other side. The corridor smelled of dust. Ancient dust. A dry, mineral, slightly sweet smell that Carter knew well from years of work in Egyptian tombs. It was the smell of time itself, or at least of time's residue. The accumulated particles of limestone and plaster and organic matter that had been sealed in a closed space for so long that they had achieved a kind of permanence, a stability that the living world outside could never match. On the afternoon of November 26, 1922, Carter stood before the second sealed doorway. Carnarvon stood behind him, along with Lady Evelyn and Arthur Callender, a friend and colleague Carter had summoned to help with the excavation. Only these four. No officials, no journalists, no spectators. Just the four of them in a narrow corridor cut into the bedrock 30 feet underground in a valley that had been keeping secrets for 3,000 years. The corridor was hot, not the dry heat of the surface, but a close, stifling warmth that came from the rock itself, from the trapped air, from the bodies of 4 people breathing in a confined space. The air was stale and thick with the dust of ancient rubble. The light from their electric torches cast sharp shadows on the plaster wall, and in those shadows the seal impressions of the necropolis officials stood out in stark relief. Oval stamps pressed into the wet plaster 3,000 years ago by hands that had since turned to dust. Carter made a small breach in the upper left corner of the door. He pushed an iron testing rod through the hole to make sure there was open space beyond, not more rubble, not solid rock, but a chamber. The rod went through. There was a void on the other side. Hot air rushed out through the hole. Air that had been sealed inside the chamber for more than 3,000 years escaped into the corridor with a whisper that Carter would later describe as a sensation that seemed almost physical. The candle he held up to the opening flickered wildly in the escaping air, guttered, nearly went out, then recovered as the pressure equalized. He widened the hole just enough to see through. He held the candle forward and peered inside. At first, he could see nothing. The hot air rising from the chamber made the candle flame dance, and the shadows it cast were wild and confusing. But as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, and as the flame steadied, shapes began to emerge from the gloom. Gold, everywhere the glint of gold. Strange shapes, half visible, half imagined, looming in the shadows beyond the candle's reach. The curve of an animal's head, the gleam of a gilded surface, the dark, steady gaze of a statue staring back at him from across 3,000 years of silence. He stood there for a long time. The others behind him, Carnarvon, Lady Evelyn, Calendar, waited in an agony of suspense. They could see nothing. Carter's body blocked the hole, and the candlelight that spilled past him was too faint to illuminate the corridor walls. They could see only his silhouette, motionless, pressed against the doorway, and the faint golden glow that seemed to emanate from the chamber beyond like the light of a small, warm fire burning in a dark room. "Can you see anything?" That is what Lord Carnarvon asked, standing behind Carter in that hot, dusty corridor, unable to bear the silence any longer. He could not see past Carter's shoulder. He could not see what the candle was illuminating. All he could see was the back of his archaeologist's head and the faint golden glow reflected on the walls of the hole. Can you see anything? And Carter, who had spent 5 years looking for this moment, who had spent 15 years being funded for it, who had spent his entire adult life preparing for it without knowing it. Carter answered with 3 words that have echoed through the history of archaeology ever since. Yes, wonderful things. It was the most famous question and answer in the history of archaeology. And what made it perfect was the restraint. Not yes, gold everywhere, or yes, treasure beyond imagination, or yes, the greatest discovery ever made. Just wonderful things. As if the English language, faced with 3,000 years of sealed darkness suddenly opened to the light, could produce nothing more adequate than that plain, quiet, overwhelmed understatement. They enlarged the hole and climbed through. The room they entered was approximately 26 feet long and 12 feet wide, not large by the standards of royal tombs, but what it contained defied comprehension. Objects were everywhere piled against the walls, stacked on top of each other, filling nearly every inch of available space. And the predominant impression, the overwhelming visual reality that struck every person who entered that room, was gold. 3 great couches dominated one wall. They were enormous, 6 feet long, perhaps 3 feet high, and each was shaped like a different animal. The first was a hippopotamus, its body gilded, its mouth stretched open in a toothy snarl. The second was a lion, or perhaps a leopard, with spots painted on its golden flanks. The third was a cow, its horns curving gracefully upward, its eyes inlaid with glass that caught the lamplight. These were not ordinary couches. They were ritual furniture, beds of the underworld upon which the dead Pharaoh would make his journey through the darkness of the afterlife and emerge, reborn, into the light of eternal day. Beneath and between and around the couches, objects were piled in extraordinary profusion. Painted and inlaid caskets, some of them works of art in their own right. Dismantled chariots, at least 4 of them, their wheels removed for storage, their gilded bodies leaning against the walls. Walking sticks, dozens of them, bundled together, their handles carved from ivory and ebony and gold. Alabaster vases, faience cups. Wooden boxes containing food offerings, roasted ducks, haunches of beef, loaves of bread, all desiccated by the dry air into forms that were still recognizable after 33 centuries. And in the center of the room, commanding attention above everything else, was the golden throne. It was a chair, let us call it that, because that is what it was. A chair made of wood, overlaid with sheet gold and silver, inlaid with colored glass and glazed ceramic and